Okay, I thought we'd try something a little bit different this time around. I've kind of reserved Fridays for like my more clickbaity videos, and this was one that I was promising a few months ago when I was talking about progressive rock in TV shows and in movies, usually when it features a single song within the score or within the actual soundtrack itself. I want to take a look at progressive rock artists and bands that have done full scores for movies. You know, this is where they're providing all of the background sounds, all the background music for the movie that you are watching. And you know, Prog has always had a very friendly relationship when it comes to music scores. In fact, a lot of directors and producers of movies will sometimes seek out bands and artists known for more of a creative and artistic touch. And a lot of prog bands do that. So I wanted to take a look at some of my favorites. Now, I want to do a little bit of a caveat first. Before we get into this, I know about Jodorowsky's Dune, and if you haven't already watched the documentary about Jodorowsky's Dune, seek it out. It is fantastic. But yes, I do know that he was going to use Pink Floyd for scoring a lot of the House Atreides of the Dune mythology, and he was going to use a lot of Magma for the House Harkonnen. But that never saw the light of day. So we're only going to look at actual soundtracks, like actual things that had been made, and you know, most of the time you can buy the soundtrack. These are also not going to be single tracks. Again, I've already done a full video about that, and I don't want to do like samples or things like that. These are legitimately the artist or the band has been labeled as writing the score for the soundtrack. So I want to talk a little bit about some honorable mentions, especially more recently. The work that Trent Reznor has been doing, both with his work with TMNT, Mutant Mayhem, as well as Challengers, a lot of his work that he did with David Lynch and the Twin Peaks series. Just, I really love his atmosphere and his ability to capture atmosphere. And same with Daft Punk doing Tron Legacy and, scoring again, that kind of very digital, very danceable kind of beats there. So I just wanted to kind of get a few of those honorable mentions out of the way before I dive deep. And I think how I'm going to do this is because a lot of these artists have done multiple scores, I want to look at each artist individually rather than talk about the individual movies. And first off, I would be remiss if I didn't start with Wendy Carlos. You know, Wendy Carlos is one of my heroes in the music business. She kind of got her start with the whole Switched on Bach kind of movement, really pioneering electronic music. And she was picked up very quickly with Stanley Kubrick with his movies of Clockwork Orange and The Shining. Her digital presentation and soundscapes provide that eerie atmosphere for those more creepy movies of The Shining and Clockwork Orange. Both of those movies probably wouldn't be the finished product that they are without Wendy's score and her atmosphere and her tones that she's able to really provide for. She also did the music for the original Tron. And so if it wasn't for her, Daft Punk wouldn't have been able to pick up the mantle there. Her Tron album really did set the bar so high of what a digital sound can sound like in a movie format. And kind of running with that a little bit is Tangerine Dream. Tangerine Dream has two standout scores. I know they have many, much more because they're very prolific within the score works, but I want to highlight Sorcerer. And Sorcerer, I feel as if is the soundtrack itself, I think is more popular than the actual movie itself. The movie is just a gripping adventure ride. It's just the tension that's found within it of this caravan trying to cross this massive jungle with this highly explosive material. And the score that provides that tension, that atmosphere, again, it's you can cut it with a knife. But the one that I love more is Legend, the Ridley Scott masterpiece from the 80s. I know that they had two scores for this movie, and I did a full video essay about that. But for me, there was something about how catchy and memorable the Tangerine Dream one was, and how they reuse these kinds of soundscapes in a more fantasy tone. The 80s were rife with that sword and sorcery movie landscape, coming in from even the 70s with Conan the Barbarian. But that had always been a very epic, grand orchestra soundscape. And what Tangerine Dream was able to utilize with more of this digital atmosphere, created a other world. It was this, you were transported to this very mythical, very high fantasy landscape, even though you weren't necessarily dealing with knights and dragons. You were literally dealing with the forces of good and evil. And I absolutely loved how Tangerine Dream was able to distill the essence of that into musical form. And let's keep on this train of more of the atmospheric, more synthesized-led digital processing. We got to talk about Vangelis. My man, I love Vangelis. I love his work that he did with John Anderson. I love his usual, just the Vangelis soundscapes. But I think we all know the big sounds from his two big ones of Chariots of Fire. Like it's one of the first meme songs whenever anybody's running for something with Chariots of Fire. But also with Blade Runner. I think those are his two really big scores. I didn't even realize that he did Alexander. Do y'all remember Alexander when they were trying to do those big epic historical pieces back in the early 2000s? Because I completely forgot about Alexander. But yeah, he scored that one as well. But yeah, Chariots of Fire for me is still probably my favorite, just with the odyssey that is the second side of that record, because I usually listen to it on vinyl. And just that whole second side suite is just fantastic. And it goes through so many different moods and styles and ebbs and flows. It just captures the overall essence of that film. And same with Blade Runner, much like how Tangerine Dream with Legend, I feel like Vangelis does the same thing, but in a sci-fi aspect. Hans Zimmer tried to capture that same feeling, and I think for the most part he succeeded within Blade Runner 2049. And hot take, I think Blade Runner 2049 is a better film. I know it's a hot take, but that groundwork that Vangelis did within the soundscapes and the soundtracks, it once again felt otherworldly. It felt very 80s noir, neo-noir feels, and that darkness, but also having these bright futuristic tones that are found within it. Being hey, the future might not be as glossy as a Flash Gordon. It might be as dirgy as a Blade Runner. All right, let's talk about some big bands. Let's talk about some big bands specifically in the prog sphere. Let's talk about Pink Floyd. We know Pink Floyd did two soundtracks. The first one by Moore. Moore's probably the more well-known one that it is a soundtrack, but also Obscured by Clouds is technically a soundtrack for the French impressionistic film of La Vallée. By Barbara Schroeder. They took bits and pieces and, tried to construct an album out of that. And I believe it was Roger Waters on the Echoes in Pompeii, kind of documentary film, where he talks about how Obscured by Clouds should have been this really standout piece for the band. And it was just due to production rushes and tight deadlines that they couldn't make the album that they wanted to. And it more served as a soundtrack to that film. It's kind of a shame because I really love Obscured by Clouds, the album. There's some moments on there that I really, really appreciate and I really love. But you can see that it was rushed. It was kind of a botched project. Whereas Moore is, I keep saying Moore, Alan Moore. And I think this is one of the cases where the soundtrack is much more popular than the film, just because the score was done by Pink Floyd. Yeah, those were the two big soundtracks for Pink Floyd. And again, keeping in the traditional progressive rock era, let's talk about Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel did three big soundtracks. His first one was Birdie, which was, I actually had to study a Birdie in my psychology degree, just talking about delusions and how people can work themselves into, having delusions. Where's the line between delusional and delusions? And I believe it also has Nicolas Cage. I want to say it has Nicolas Cage in it, a very young one. But there's a lot of moments from that movie that are right from his fourth record. And so much of his writing process as a craft, you can see on those soundtracks. The other two is Rabbit Proof Fence. The soundtrack itself was, I believe, called The Long Walk Home. And I think that one might be my favorite of his. It's very atmospheric. There's a lot of moments that are found on there that's found on Up, specifically Signal to Noise and Sky Blue. I think it's Sky Blue or Blue Sky. That kind of start with, again, that writing process. And he has these themes and he has these melodies in mind that he doesn't quite know what to do with, but they fit very well the tone or the atmosphere of the particular scene that the movie makers have in mind. And again, I had to study Rabbit Proof Fence in school, and I'm like, oh, Peter Gabriel does the soundtrack to this, or does the score to that. Peter Gabriel picks some pretty heavy topics. The last one being The Last Temptation of Christ, or The Passion. And this one, it has like a lot of those really guttural tones, you know, like just otherworldly, trying to touch the divine, especially within The Last Temptation of Christ. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful moments on there one. Let's end this off by talking about some keyboardists and their run of soundtracks. Much like Vangelis and a lot of those synth workers, a lot of very prominent proggers within these bands have done soundtracks. Let's talk about Keith Emerson, you know, from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He did Nighthawks. He also, I can't believe this, but he did Godzilla, The Final Wars. I'm a huge Godzilla fan, so I was shocked to see that. He also did The Church, Inferno, Gemma Wars, and Murder Rock. I mean, the guy is extremely prolific, and he brings that soundscape, that knowledge of how to construct these emotional essences within a score. And he's able to just bring that forth onto the screen so very well. I think his most popular ones is Nighthawks, because my dad has a copy of that because he loves that movie so much. But also my man from Tony Banks, my man from Genesis, has done a handful of them. I think his most famous one is The Wicked Lady from the 70s or 80s. But he also did Quicksilver and Lorca and the Outlaws. But once again, I think The Wicked Lady is his most popular one. I also want to say it's his first one. But, you know, again, master of atmosphere. And I think that's where these, you know, composers really do fit very well within these bands of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as well as Genesis, because they are the masters of the atmosphere, of creating the groundwork, of creating that tone, that bass line for everything else to kind of flourish around. Now, both Emerson and Banks are able to take the reins and, you know, provide the spotlights. And in a lot of these movies, they also do that quite well. But yeah, I also know that Rick Wakeman has done a number of them. I think he did Litsomania, that was the one. All about the surreal biographical musical comedy from Franz Liszt. Yeah, it was interesting. And I know Rick Wakeman has done a number of like scores as well. But I think what he likes to do more is like scoring a movie after the fact. Like he did a whole Phantom of the Opera, which not good. It's one of my least favorite projects that he's ever done. So yeah, those are my lists. Those are my prog artists, bands, and composers that have done full-on scores of movies. What are some of your favorite movies that have been scored by even just like popular artists? Like I know a lot of more bands nowadays are scoring movies, and I think that's a great idea. I mean, hey, they write music for a living, might as well score some movies. So let me know about yours by commenting down below. And yeah, I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys for today. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. I almost tripped over my words on that one. And until next time, notes out.